was tempted to say something to her. For the time being, however, he decided to have smoke, and he lit a cigarette. It would certainly appear that plastic was a necessity of life here. He got the match to light, but the cigarette had become unsmokable. He took strong drags on it, sucking in his cheeks between his teeth. Yet, no matter how he puffed, he got only the taste of smoke, an extremely greasy smoke that irritated his tongue. The cigarette was worse than useless. The experience quite spoiled his frame of mind and took away any desire he might have had to speak to the woman. She attended to the dirty dishes, placing them on the earthen floor and slowly heaping up sand on them. Then she said hesitantly, "I'm going to have to begin right away, getting the sand down from the ceiling." Getting the sand down? Oh, well, that's all right with me. He wondered indifferently why that would have anything to do with him now. It didn't concern him if the beams rotted and the roof fell in. "If I'm in your way, do you want me to move somewhere else?" "I'm sorry, but would you mind?" She needn't pretend. Why didn't she show even a little of her real feelings? In her heart, she probably felt as if she had bitten into a spoiled onion, but she was expressionless as she swiftly, with an unaccustomed movement, wrapped the towel folded in two around the lower part of her face and tied it behind her head. She put a whisk broom and a small piece of wood under her arm and climbed up the partition of the closet, which had only half a door remaining. Abruptly, he exclaimed, "Frankly, I'm convinced we'd both feel much better if this house fell to pieces." He was surprised himself at this peevish outburst, and the woman turned and looked at him with an even more startled look. Well, apparently she had not yet turned quite into an insect. On he went. "No, I'm not particularly angry at you. It's the whole business. I don't like this scheming where you people think you can put a man in chains. Do you realize what I'm talking about?" "No, it doesn't make any difference whether you do or not. I'll tell you an amusing story. I used to keep a worthless mongrel at my boarding house. He had a terribly thick coat that scarcely shed even in summer. He was such a sorry sight that I finally decided to cut his hair. But just as I was about to throw away the hair that had been cut off, the dog, I wonder what could have been going on in his mind, suddenly let out a pitiful howl, took a bunch of hair in his mouth, and ran into his house. He probably felt that the hair was a part of his own body and didn't want to be separated from it. He furtively observed the woman's expression. However, she made no attempt to move, remaining bent over and in the natural position on top of the partition. Well, let it go. Everyone has his own philosophy that doesn't hold good for anybody else. Go on working with your fingers to the bone, with your sand sweeping or whatever else you will. But I can't stand it. I've had enough. I could get out of here easily if I wanted to, and I've just run out of cigarettes. Oh, I wanted to say about the cigarettes," she said awkwardly and submissively. "When they deliver the water later." "Cigarettes? Do they bring you cigarettes too?" He laughed in spite of himself. "That's not the question. I'm talking about the tufts of hair. Tufts of hair. Don't you understand? What I'm trying to say is that there's no sense in such futile concern over a tuft of hair." She was silent. She showed no sign of offering any explanation. She waited a moment, and when it was evident he had stopped speaking, she slowly turned as if nothing had happened and resumed her unfinished work. She slid back the cover over the top of the closet and crawled up, working the upper part of her body into the aperture with her elbows and wiggling her legs clumsily. The sand began to fall in thin rivulets here and there. He had the feeling that there was some strange insect inside the ceiling. Sand and rotted wood? No, thank you. He had had enough of strange things. Then, from one corner of the ceiling, the sand began to pour out dizzily in numerous tape-like streams. The strange quietness was in eerie contrast to the violence of the flow of sand. The holes and cracks in the ceiling boards were quickly raised in exact relief on the straw matting. The sand burned in his nose and irritated his eyes. He fled out of the house. Suddenly, he felt as though he were melting away from his feet upward into a landscape of flame. But something, like a perpetual shaft of ice, remained in the center of his body. He felt ashamed in some way, an animal like woman, thinking only in terms of today. No yesterday, no tomorrow, with a dot for a heart. A world where people were convinced that men could be erased like chalk marks from a blackboard. In his wildest dreams, he could not have imagined that such barbarism still existed anywhere in the world. Well, anyway, if this was a sign that he was beginning to regain his composure and recover from his initial shock, his qualms of conscience were not a bad thing. But he must not waste time. If possible, he would like to finish before it got dark. Squinting, he measured the height of the sand wall quivering behind a film of heat waves like molten glass. Every time he looked at it, it seemed to grow higher. It would be hard to go against nature and try and make a gentle slope abrupt. He only wanted to try to make a steep one more gentle. There was no reason to hang back. The best way to do it, of course, would be to shave it down gradually from the top. Since this was impossible, he had no choice but to dig from the bottom. First he would scoop out a suitable amount of sand from below and wait for the sand about to cave in. Then he would scoop more again and let the top fall in. If he repeated this again and again, the ground level he stood on would gradually rise and ultimately reach the top. Of course, he might also be carried away by the flowing sand in the midst of the operation. But no matter how much the sand flowed, it wasn't water, and he had never yet heard about anyone being drowned in sand. The shovel was standing with the kerosene cans against the outside wall that went around the earthen floor. The dented edge of the shovel gleamed white like a piece of cracked porcelain. For some time he concentrated on digging. The sand was exceedingly tractable, and his work appeared to be progressing. The sound of the shovel as it bit into the sand and his own breathing ticked away the time. However, at last his arms began to grow weary. He thought he had worked for a considerable time, but his digging had apparently had no results at all. Only a little bit of sand had fallen right above where he was digging. Somehow, it was working out very differently from the simple geometric process he had evolved in his head. Rather than worry further, he decided to take advantage of a rest period and put his theory to rest by constructing a model for the hole. Fortunately, materials were plentiful. He chose a spot in the shade of the eaves and dug a hollow about a half-yard wide. But the incline of the slope did not make the angle he had anticipated. It was only 45 degrees at most, about like a wide-mouthed mixing bowl. When he tried scooping sand from the bottom, the sand flowed down the sides, but the incline remained the same. There would appear to be a fixed angle for sand. The weight and resistance of the grains seemed to be in perfect balance. Supposing this were true, did the wall he was trying to overcome have about the same degree of incline? No, that could not be. It might be an illusion, but it could not be true. When you looked at any incline from below, it obviously appeared less than it actually was. Then, shouldn't he perhaps consider it to be a question of quantity? The pressure would naturally change with different amounts of sand. If the pressure changed, a variation in the balance of weight and resistance would naturally occur. Perhaps it depended on the nature of the sand grains. Clay that has been packed down and clay from a natural deposit have completely different resistance to pressure. Furthermore, he had to consider the question of moisture. In short, another law was probably functioning different from the one that applied to the model he had made. Despite his failure, the experiment was not completely in vain. The very fact that he now realized that the slope of the wall was in fact what he might call a superstable state was an important find. Generally, it is not particularly difficult to make a superstable state into a normally stable one. A supersaturated solution, just by being shaken, at once produces a crystalline precipitate and moves towards the normal saturation point. Suddenly, he had the feeling that someone was near. He turned around. He had been unaware of the woman who was standing in the doorway, staring fixedly at him. He was understandably embarrassed and took a step back in confusion, glancing around as if in search of help. He raised his eyes, and there at the top of the east bank were three men, all in a row, looking down at him. They wore towels wrapped around their heads. As they were not visible from the mouth down, he cannot be sure, but they seemed to be the old men of the day before. At once he straightened up, but just as suddenly he changed his mind and decided to ignore them and go on with his work. The fact that he was being watched spurred him on. The precipitation ran into his eyes and dripped from the end of his nose. Since there was no time to wipe it away, he just closed his eyes and shoveled. Under no condition must he rest his arms. When they saw him unflagging pace, they would realize, unless they were dimwits, how despicable they were. He looked at his watch. He wiped it against his pants to remove the sand on his face. It was only 2:10, the same 10 minutes after 2 as when he had looked before. He suddenly lost confidence in his pace. From a snail's point of view, the sun probably moves with the speed of a baseball. He changed his grip on the shovel, and turning back again to the wall, he set frantically to work. Suddenly, the flow of sand grew violent. There was a muffled sound and then a pressure against his chest. He tried to look up to see what was happening, but he no longer had any sense of direction. He was only dimly aware of a faint milky light playing over him as he lay doubled up in the black splotch of his vomit. Jabu, jabu, jabu. What sound is that? It's the sound of the bell. Jabu, jabu, jabu. What voice is that? It's the voice of the devil. The woman sang as if murmuring to herself, tirelessly repeating the same verses as she scooped the slime from the water jar. When the song stopped, the sound of rice being ground came to his ears. He sighed gently, rolled over and waited, his body tight with expectancy. Soon the woman brought a wash basin filled with water, probably to sponge off his body. His skin, which was puffy from sand and perspiration, was becoming inflamed. He lay there, anticipating the cool, damp towel. He had been in bed ever since he had fainted in the sand. For the first 2 days he had a fever of around 100 and had vomited constantly, but on the following day the fever had dropped and he had partially recovered his appetite. The basic cause was probably not the injury he had received in the sand avalanche, but the unaccustomed exertion he had kept up for so long, exposed to the direct rays of the sun. Anyway, in the long run, it hadn't amounted to much. That was probably why he recovered so quickly. On the fourth day, the pain in his legs and loins had almost gone away. On the fifth, except for certain heaviness, no more symptoms were apparent. Nevertheless, he stayed in bed, giving an outward show of being seriously ill. But of course there was motive and calculation in this. Naturally, he had not for a moment abandoned his plans for escape. "Are you awake?" She was calling to him timidly. Out of the corner of his half-closed eyes he noticed the roundness of her knee through her work trousers. He answered her with a wordless groan. Slowly squeezing out the towel in the dented brass wash-basin, she asked, "How do you feel?" "Well, a little better." "Do you want me to wipe your back?" He did not particularly mind abandoning himself to the woman's hands, since he had the excuse of being sick. He remembered vaguely that he had read a poem about a feverish child who had dreamt he was enveloped in cool silver paper. His sand-clogged skin was suddenly cool and fresh again. The odor of the woman slipped over his quickened body, subtly stimulating him. Even so, he cannot completely forgive her. This feeling for her was one thing, but what she had done was another. And he had to distinguish between them, at least for the time being. His 3-day holiday had already gone by. It was no use struggling any more. The failure of his first plan to level off the sand slope by breaking down the cliff was due to lack of preparation as much as anything. It would have worked well if not for the sunstroke, but the labor of digging out the sand had been more exhausting than he had imagined. He had to adopt a more workable method, and thus he had hit upon his feigned illness. When he had recovered his senses, he had been somewhat displeased to realize that he had been put to bed in the woman's house. The villagers apparently had no intention of showing him any sympathy. He understood this, but he had his own idea. They had underestimated his condition and had not called a doctor. He would make them really sorry. He would sleep soundly during the night while the woman was working, and conversely, during the day when she had to rest, he would disturb her sleep by exaggerated complaints of pain. "Does it hurt?" "Of course it hurts. My spine must be dislocated someplace." "Shall I massage it?" "My God, no! I couldn't stand being crumbled with by an amateur. Spinal nerves are vital. What would you do if I died? You'd be the ones in trouble, wouldn't you? Call a doctor. A doctor! Oh, it hurts. I can't stand this pain. If you don't hurry, it'll be too late." The woman, unable to endure the strain of the situation, would soon be exhausted. Her capacity for work would drop, and even the safety of the building would be threatened. It would be a matter of no little importance for the village, too. Far from having someone to help them work, they had got themselves a real stumbling block. If they did not get him out at once, the situation would get completely out of hand. But this scheme, too, did not go as smoothly as he had anticipated. Here the nights were busier than the days. The sounds of the shovel, which he could hear through the walls, the woman's breathing, the whistling and the cries of the men carrying the hoist baskets, the muffled roar of the three-wheeled truck, muted by the wind, the distant howling of dogs. The more he tried to sleep, the more nervous he became, and he would awaken completely. When he did not get enough sleep at night, he cannot avoid napping during the day. But what was worse was knowing that, if this idea failed, there would always be some other way of escape, and he was somewhat impatient with the present situation. It had already been a week. It would be just about now that a request for investigation would be submitted. The first 3 days had been his regular vacation, but after that he would be absent without notice. His colleagues, who were usually very sensitive to what other people were about, would surely not let this go unheeded. Perhaps that very evening some busybody would appear and snoop around his boarding house. The plain room, smelly and closed in the afternoon sun, would betray the absence of its owner. Perhaps the caller would be instinctively jealous of the lucky man who had been freed from his hole.